In the autumn of 1898, a man named Aldous Pemberton walked out of a mine shaft in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada and refused to ever enter another one for the remainder of his life. He was 34 years old. He had been working as a hard rock miner for 16 years. He was, by the testimony of the men who had worked alongside him, one of the most experienced underground operators in the entire Mother Lode region, the long belt of gold-bearing quartz that ran for 120 miles along the western flank of the Sierra Nevada, and that had produced, by that date, more wealth than any single geographic feature in the recorded history of the United States. Pemberton had descended into the Argonaut mine that morning as part of a four-man crew assigned to investigate a rumoured side passage that had been reported by an earlier exploratory team. He came out of the shaft alone 10 hours later, his lantern still burning, his face white and his hands shaking so badly that he could not hold a cup of coffee for the first 3 hours after his return. The other 3 members of his crew did not come out. They were not lost. They had not been injured. They had simply, according to Pemberton's own statement to the mine foreman, decided to remain below. This is the public story of what happened to the Pemberton crew on October 14, 1898, the official version, recorded in the mine company's incident log and reproduced in the regional newspaper coverage of the period, described the event as a tragic accident. 3 miners had become disoriented in an unmapped side passage. Pemberton, the senior man on the crew, had been unable to extract them. By the time a rescue team was assembled and dispatched, the side passage had partially collapsed, and the bodies of the 3 missing miners could not be recovered. Pemberton was placed on indefinite leave from the company. He never returned to work. He moved with his wife to a small farm in the Sacramento Valley, where he lived quietly until his death in 1934. He gave one interview in his life, in 1928, to a regional historian named Elmore Davenport, who was working on a book about the early years of the California gold mining industry. The interview was conducted at Pemberton's farm. It lasted 4 hours. It was recorded in shorthand by Davenport's research assistant. The transcript runs to 47 pages. The book Davenport was working on was never finished. He died in 1931 of pneumonia. His papers, including the transcript of the Pemberton interview, were donated by his widow to a small historical society in Stockton, California. The papers were catalogued, placed in a storage box in the basement of the society's headquarters, and forgotten for the next 60 years. In 1993, a graduate student researching the labor history of the California gold mines came across the box and read the transcript. What she found was not a description of a mining accident. It was a description of something else entirely, something that the official version of the Pemberton incident had spent 100 years carefully obscuring. Something that, if it was true, did not just contradict the recorded history of the Argonaut mine. It contradicted the entire received story of what the Mother Lode actually was, who had built it, and what had been buried beneath the foothills of the Sierra Nevada long before the first American prospectors arrived in 1849. This is the story of what Aldous Pemberton saw at the bottom of the mine shaft in October of 1898, why his testimony was suppressed, and what the geological and economic record of the Mother Lode actually tells us about the deep history of California once you stop accepting the textbook version of the gold rush at face value. If you want more of these investigations, the kind of buried economic history the establishment has spent generations trying to keep out of the public conversation, subscribe to the channel right now. New videos drop every week, and we go after the questions the official record has spent over a century closing. To understand why the Pemberton transcript was so disturbing to the graduate student who found it in 1993, and why the historians who have read it since have been so reluctant to discuss it in public forums, you have to first understand what the Mother Lode is supposed to be, and what the standard story of its discovery and exploitation looks like. The Mother Lode is the popular name for a belt of gold-bearing quartz veins that runs along the western foothills of the Sierra Nevada from approximately the town of Mariposa in the south to the town of Auburn in the north. The belt was discovered, according to the official record, in January of 1848, when a carpenter named James Marshall noticed flakes of gold in the tail race of a sawmill he was building for John Sutter on the American River. Marshall's discovery was reported to Sutter. Sutter tried to keep the discovery quiet. The news leaked anyway. By the spring of 1849, tens of thousands of prospectors were arriving in California from every corner of the world. The gold rush, as it came to be called, became one of the largest voluntary migrations in human history. By 1855, more than 300,000 people had moved to California in pursuit of gold. The state's population, which had been negligible in 1848, had become the fastest growing in the nation. The wealth extracted from the Mother Lode in the first decade alone was estimated at more than $2 billion in contemporary value. The Mother Lode, by every measure the standard textbooks acknowledge, was the foundation of California's economic emergence and one of the most consequential geological and economic events of the 19th century. The standard story has a problem, and the problem is geological. The veins of the Mother Lode, when examined by trained geologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, did not look like the kind of natural mineral deposits that the standard story required. They were, in many sections, too regular. The walls of the deeper shafts, when miners reached them, showed evidence of working that the official record could not explain. There were chambers that had clearly been excavated by human hands long before 1849. There were drift tunnels that had been timbered with materials the geologists could not identify. There were tool marks on the rock faces that did not match any of the techniques used by the post-1848 American mining operations. And there were, in the deepest sections of certain mines, structural features that pointed to a far older and far more sophisticated mining tradition than the United States had brought to the region. These features were noted in the technical literature of the period. They were discussed at meetings of the regional geological societies. They were occasionally mentioned in the trade publications of the mining industry. And they were, with remarkable consistency, omitted from the public-facing account of the gold rush that became the standard textbook narrative. This is the context in which the Pemberton incident occurred. By 1898, the easy surface gold of the Mother Lode had long since been extracted. The remaining gold was in the deep quartz veins, and reaching it required hard rock mining at depths that, in some operations, exceeded 3,000 feet. The Argonaut mine, where Pemberton was working, was one of the deepest operations in the region. The shaft had been driven down through layered rock formations that, by 1898, had revealed multiple anomalies. The mine foreman had reported encountering, at various depths, what they described as old workings, meaning excavated chambers and passages that predated the Argonaut mine itself. The standard explanation, when these old workings were mentioned in the company records at all, was that they had been left by Spanish or Mexican miners working the region in the 18th and early 19th centuries, before the American period. This explanation, when examined closely, did not hold up. The Spanish and Mexican mining presence in the Sierra Nevada foothills, while real, had been small in scale and had operated almost entirely at surface or shallow depths. The deep workings encountered in the Argonaut and similar mines were at depths and of a sophistication that the documented Spanish and Mexican operations could not have produced. The official explanation was a placeholder, used to cover an anomaly that the company management did not wish to investigate in any rigorous way. Pemberton, on the morning of October 14, 1898, was sent into one of these old workings. The side passage his crew was assigned to investigate had been encountered 3 weeks earlier by a survey team. The survey team had reported a chamber at a depth of approximately 2,800 feet that did not match anything else in the mine. The chamber had clearly been excavated, the walls were dressed, the floor was level. There were features in the chamber that the survey team had not been able to identify in the time available before they had to return to the surface. The company foreman had decided to send a more experienced crew, led by Pemberton, to make a thorough examination. What Pemberton described in the 1928 interview, in the words preserved in the Davenport transcript, was a chamber that the standard explanation could not account for. The chamber was approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. The ceiling was vaulted. The walls were dressed stone, fitted together with a precision that Pemberton, in his 16 years of mining experience, had never seen in any other context. The floor was level and was covered with a layer of fine dust that, when disturbed, revealed a worked stone surface beneath. At the far end of the chamber, opposite the entrance through which Pemberton's crew had come, there was a doorway. The doorway was not a natural opening. It was a deliberately constructed architectural feature with a lintel, with finished sides, with what Pemberton described as a kind of carved threshold at its base. Beyond the doorway, the passage continued. The crew had not been instructed to go beyond the chamber, but the doorway was so striking that they had decided to investigate. What Pemberton described seeing beyond the doorway, in the testimony preserved in the Davenport transcript, was a series of additional chambers connected by similar dressed stone passages, extending far deeper into the mountain than the existing mine plan had ever suggested. The chambers were not empty. They contained what Pemberton described as objects, structures, and architectural features that he could not categorize within any framework available to him in 1898. He used phrases in the interview that have been reproduced in the transcript without paraphrase. He spoke of walls that were polished to a degree of finish he had never seen in any natural or constructed surface. He spoke of geometric features that did not correspond to any decorative tradition he was familiar with. He spoke of a quality of construction throughout the deeper chambers that was so far in advance of any 19th century work he had encountered that he initially could not believe what he was looking at. The three other members of the crew, according to Pemberton's account, became increasingly disturbed as they moved through the deeper chambers. By the time they reached what Pemberton estimated was the fourth chamber, perhaps 200 yards from the original entrance, two of the men were arguing for an immediate return to the surface. The third member of the crew, a younger miner named Cornelius Stack, was insisting that they continue. Stack had picked up a fragment of dressed stone from the floor of one of the chambers and was holding it in his hand, examining the surface, when, according to Pemberton's testimony, the lantern Stack was carrying began to flicker in a pattern that did not correspond to any normal lantern behavior. The flickering, Pemberton said, was rhythmic. It corresponded to nothing in the air movement of the chamber. It continued for several minutes, then Stack dropped the lantern. He did not pick it up. He turned away from the others, walked deeper into the chamber, and did not respond to their calls. The other two members of the crew followed Stack. Pemberton, in his account, said he tried to stop them. He could not. They walked through the chamber, through another doorway at the far end, into a passage that descended deeper into the mountain. Pemberton, holding his own lantern, followed for some distance, calling to them, attempting to bring them back. They did not respond. He continued to follow them through what he estimated was at least 3 more chambers, each one more elaborate than the last, each one with features that he could not categorize. At a point that he could not later precisely locate on any map of the mine, the 3 men passed through a final doorway into a chamber that Pemberton, in his interview, refused to describe in any detail. He said only that what was in that chamber was something that no human being in his time was prepared to encounter. He said that the 3 men entered the chamber. He said that he, Pemberton, did not. He said that he stood at the threshold of the doorway, looking in, holding his lantern up so that the light would fall on the interior. And he said that what his lantern showed him in that chamber was a structure, an arrangement, a configuration of materials and features that convinced him in a single moment that the entire received history of California, of North America, of the human civilizations that had occupied the continent before the European arrival, was wrong in fundamental and irrecoverable ways. He did not enter the chamber. He turned, took his lantern, and retraced the route to the original entrance. He climbed back up through the levels of the mine. He emerged at the surface 10 hours after his initial descent. He reported the incident to the foreman in terms that he later described in the 1928 interview as the most heavily edited statement he had ever given in his life. He said only that the 3 men had been lost in an unmapped side passage. He said that he had been unable to retrieve them. He said that the side passage was unstable and that any rescue attempt would be dangerous. The mine company sent a rescue team the following day. The rescue team did not, according to the company records, find the chambers that Pemberton had described. They found a partial collapse in the original side passage, no sign of the 3 missing miners, and no evidence of the dressed stone construction that Pemberton, in his private interview 30 years later, would describe in such detail. This is the testimony preserved in the Davenport transcript. It has been read, since its rediscovery in 1993, by a small number of researchers who have sought it out in the archives of the Stockton Historical Society. The transcript has not been published in any major academic venue. The story has not been incorporated into the standard histories of California mining. The Argonaut mine itself was finally closed in 1942 after a fire in 1922 that killed 47 men in what became one of the worst mining disasters in American history. The mine was sealed. The deep workings were never reopened. The chambers that Pemberton described, if they existed, are still there, somewhere in the rock under the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, behind a barrier that nobody has had the resources or the inclination to remove for over 100 years. What does this story actually tell us if we take it seriously? It tells us, if Pemberton's account is accurate, that the deep workings of the Mother Lode contained evidence of a constructed underground architecture that predated the American mining operations of the 19th century, that predated the Spanish and Mexican operations that the standard explanation invokes, and that pointed to a level of construction sophistication that the documented pre-Columbian history of the region cannot account for. The Mother Lode, in this reading, was not simply a natural geological deposit that the gold rush prospectors stumbled upon in 1848. It was a mining region that had been worked, perhaps repeatedly, by earlier civilizations whose presence in California has been deliberately omitted from the textbook narrative. The chambers Pemberton described were not the work of any culture the standard archaeology of California acknowledges. They were the work of something older, more sophisticated, and more strange than the curriculum allows. The implications for the economic history of California and for the broader question of pre-Columbian North American civilization are significant. The standard story tells us that California was, before 1848, a region of dispersed indigenous populations operating at a relatively low technological level, with no significant mining or metallurgical tradition. The Pemberton testimony, if true, tells us that California had been, at some point in the deep past, the site of organized industrial-scale mining operations conducted by a civilization with construction techniques that the late 19th century American operators could not match. The gold rush, in this reading, was not a discovery. It was a rediscovery. The Americans of 1849 were not the first to extract wealth from the quartz veins of the Sierra Nevada. They were the latest in a sequence, and the original miners, whoever they had been, had left behind evidence of their presence that the deep mining operations of the late 19th century occasionally encountered, evidence that was, with remarkable consistency, suppressed from the public record. This pattern of suppression is the pattern that the larger field of revisionist economic history has been documenting for decades. The mining regions of the world are full of these accounts. There are Pemberton equivalent stories from the deep workings of the Comstock Lode in Nevada, from the Witwatersrand Basin in South Africa, from the Bolivian silver mines of Potosi, from the Australian goldfields, from the deep tin operations of Cornwall in England, from the copper mines of Central Asia. In each case, the deep workings of major mining regions, when they were finally reached by the modern industrial operations of the 19th and early 20th centuries, contained evidence of earlier and more sophisticated mining traditions than the official histories acknowledge. In each case, The evidence was noted in the field by the working miners and engineers, was occasionally reported in the technical literature, and was then quietly omitted from the public-facing histories that became the standard textbook accounts. The pattern is too consistent across too many continents and too many time periods to be the result of coincidence. The pattern points to a deep history of human mining and industrial activity that the modern academic establishment has chosen, for reasons that are partly political and partly institutional, not to incorporate into the standard curriculum. Consider Potosi. The silver mountain of Potosi, in the highlands of what is now Bolivia, was the single most important source of silver in the world for nearly 3 centuries. The standard story credits the Spanish with the discovery of the deposit in 1545 and with the construction of the mining infrastructure that followed. The Spanish records themselves, when read carefully, tell a different story. The early Spanish chroniclers describe encountering existing workings on the mountain when they arrived. They describe networks of tunnels, drainage systems, and excavated chambers that the local indigenous populations told them had been there for as long as anybody could remember. The indigenous accounts were treated by the Spanish as folklore. The existing workings were incorporated into the Spanish operations, and the question of their origin was set aside. By the time the modern academic establishment came to write the standard history of Potosi in the late 19th and 20th centuries, the inherited workings had been quietly absorbed into the Spanish account. The same pattern appears at the Witwatersrand Basin, where the late 19th century South African gold operations encountered at depth evidence of earlier excavations that the standard history of African mining cannot account for. The same pattern appears at the deep tin workings of Cornwall, where the Victorian-era industrial operations encountered tunnels and chambers that predated any documented mining tradition. In each case, the inherited infrastructure was incorporated into the modern operation. In each case, the question of its origin was set aside. In each case, the standard history was written as if the modern operation had been the original one. The Mother Lode, in this larger context, is not unique. It is one node in a global network of mining regions whose deep history has been buried beneath the modern industrial accounts. The chambers Pemberton described, if they exist, are evidence of one of these older mining traditions. The American operators of the late 19th century did not build them. The Spanish and Mexican operators of the 18th century did not build them. The indigenous populations whose presence in California predated the European arrival did not, by any standard archaeological account, possess the technical capacity to build them. They were built by something else. By whom, by when, by what means, the standard record will not say. But the deep workings of the Argonaut mines, sealed since 1942, presumably still contain whatever Pemberton saw. The answer is still there if anyone with the resources and the inclination decided to look for it. The geological and economic record of the Mother Lode, when examined honestly, contains many anomalies that the standard story does not account for. The gold yield from the Mother Lode in the first decade of operation exceeded what the natural geological richness of the deposit could plausibly have supported. The pattern of vein distribution showed signs of having been previously worked. The deep shafts of the major mines repeatedly encountered features that the official explanation could not account for. The labour histories of the miners contain numerous accounts of unexplained encounters, sealed passages, and mine sections that were closed without official explanation. The Pemberton testimony is the most detailed of these accounts. It is not the only one. It is part of a body of evidence that, taken as a whole, points to a deep history of California, mining that is not the history that the textbooks describe. The economic implications of this revised history are substantial. The wealth extracted from the Mother Lode was, by every official measure, the foundation of California's economic emergence and a major component of the broader American industrial expansion of the late 19th century. If a significant portion of that wealth was extracted from veins that had been previously identified, opened, and partially worked by an earlier civilization, then the standard narrative of American industrial origins requires significant revision. The wealth was not discovered by the American prospectors. It was, in part, inherited from a previous mining tradition whose existence has been carefully omitted from the historical record. The same logic applies to the other major mining regions of the modern industrial era. The economic foundations of the modern world rest, in part, on inherited resources whose origin has been systematically reattributed. This is the larger pattern that the Pemberton testimony points to. It is not just a story about one miner's strange experience in the deep workings of one California gold mine in 1898. It is a window onto a much larger and much stranger history of human industrial activity on this continent and on others, a history that the modern academic establishment has chosen not to teach, a history whose physical evidence is still present in sealed mine shafts and forgotten archives across the world. The Pemberton transcript is one fragment of that evidence. It has survived by accident through a century of institutional neglect. It is now being read slowly by the kind of researchers who are willing to take the evidence seriously rather than dismiss it as folklore. Pemberton himself, in the 1928 interview, said something near the end of the transcript that has stayed with the researchers who have read his testimony. He said that he had not entered the final chamber because he had understood, in the moment when his lantern showed him what was inside, that the chamber was not meant for him. He said that the 3 members of his crew who had walked into the chamber had, in some sense he could not articulate, been chosen by it. He said that he had stood at the threshold and had been allowed to see what was inside, but had not been allowed to enter. He said that he believed by the time of the 1928 interview that the 3 men were still alive somewhere beyond the chamber, in the structure of passages and rooms that extended deeper into the mountain than any modern mine plan acknowledged. He said that he had spent the 30 years since the incident attempting to forget what his lantern had shown him at the threshold, and that he had failed. He said that on every clear night, looking up at the foothills of the Sierra Nevada from his farm in the Sacramento Valley, he could feel the chamber there beneath the rock, still occupied, still functioning, still waiting for whatever it had been built to wait for. Pemberton died in 1934. He never wrote down his account in his own hand. The Davenport transcript is the only record of his testimony. The mine he worked is sealed. The chambers he described, if they exist, are still there. The history of the Mother Lode, as the textbooks tell it, continues. The history that Pemberton's lantern showed him, the history of an older and stranger civilization that had worked the gold of California long before the Americans arrived, remains officially unrecognized. If this is the kind of investigation you came here for, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with somebody who is willing to ask hard questions about the economic history we have been handed. And keep watching, because there is more to come. The Mother Lode is one chapter. The deep workings of the Comstock and the Witwatersrand are another. The inherited industrial history of the modern world is another. We are working through them one at a time, and the more of us who refuse to look away, the harder it becomes to keep the chambers sealed forever.